Welcome back, everybody. In the next 15 minutes, we are going to be talking specifically about seller incentives and realtor inducements. So in a market like this with this many listings, realtors have been very curious as to come up with the gamut of solutions to try and make their listings stand out and differentiate themselves a little bit more by looking more competitive and a little bit more willing to do business. So there's a lot of meat and potatoes here, so let's just jump into this. David, thanks for all the research you did on this. Appreciate it. Let's just start off with the very, very basics, and then we'll get into some of the more trickier stuff. But in general, can a seller offer an incentive to a buyer directly?
The short answer is yes. A seller can offer anything they want as long as the item they're offering is legal.
Right.
How that can be viewed as we move through the transaction by other parties, including financing, lawyers, other things, are things we have to be aware of and be able to manage.
Right. Okay. As far as what an incentive is in general, specifically seller incentive to realtors, let's chat a little bit about that. So what are the different types of incentives that you see people using?
Quite often what we see is what we refer to as a bonus commission, which is kind of a misnomer because all commissions are, of course, negotiable, right? See, we're getting you slowly trained. Pretty soon we'll have to get you a license.
Right?
I know. So all commissions are negotiable, but typically we know we see 3.5, 1.5. And realtors will make the error sometimes in their private remarks and refer to it as a bonus when they offer an additional, 3.5, 1.5, plus 1,000, plus 2,000. Those are perfectly legal, can be done either at the listing stage and included there, can be introduced during the transaction. RECA views all commissions as a negotiable item at any time, right up to and part of the closing if necessary. So we can put it there and we can say to the seller, do you want to? And when we write our listing agreement, instead of we might do 7 and 3 plus 2, and we'd offer 3.5 plus 2K. So that's a very easy seller incentive to do because one, the money comes from proceeds of sale. So as long as there's equity in the home, the seller doesn't have to come up with the cash out of their pocket,
right,
which is kind of nice. So that's an easy one. Some of the other more creative ones that they get into, they'll offer trips. They can offer, seasons tickets to the Stampeders, we'll say. Maybe not the Flames, because I'm not a big hockey guy. But those are different things they can offer, but they're going to be viewed differently, and they may affect buyer financing.
Right. What about, and let's just mention that as far as cashback. Mm-hmm. So for some sort of deficit that a potential buyer sees in the home for a holdback. Do you want to talk about those ones for a minute as well? Because that's pretty common.
Mm-hmm. Well, and sometimes when we look at a listing and we would love to be able to paint it. We'd love to be able to replace that worn carpet, but the funds just aren't available for the seller to do that.
Right.
So they can offer an allowance. We record it in the private remarks. Seller offers, flooring allowance $2,000 for replacement of carpet or a painting allowance, however we want it structured. And banks typically are okay with any inducement offered by a seller or an incentive like that, as long as it's going to improve the value of the home. If they were to say, here's $2,000 cash back, have a good time with it, they view that as adding zero value to the home, and they would deduct that off the amount they would be able to mortgage. So if they had an approved mortgage they needed of $300, the bank would only advance funds of $298 because you're getting $2,000 back, as an easy example.
Right.
So we want to be careful with how we structure those. Quite often the bank will want, instead of just seeing it, and it's also not the bank, it's the insurer. And the insurers will view these on a case-by-case basis. So sometimes if we've offered that and we agree to it, the best way to structure it is actually with an amendment to the purchase contract requiring the seller to do repairs. So, they have to repair X by this date. If they don't, a holdback is done and released to the buyer on. Now, the seller has to be willing, when we're entering into this as realtors, we can't use this as a workaround of giving $2,000 back to the buyer. That basically would constitute mortgage fraud. So we would want to be reasonably assured by our client that they're going to perform to their best efforts to do the required repair.
And use the money, what the money was meant to be used for.
Exactly. So they would go ahead and, do the painting, do the replace of the carpet, and they're well within the rules then. If they couldn't for some reason do it, then but they had intended to, we're okay writing that term in, but we expect them to act in good faith, and the bank is asking us to make sure they act in good faith. So we can't use it as a workaround to provide a cashback. It's just not the way you should be doing it. If you're going to do that, then you need to write it as that, and then as a buyer's realtor, you have to be aware it may affect the amount of the mortgage you get.
Right.
The other thing we can do at that point is if the seller was unable and did not have the funds, realtors are allowed to pay for things and be reimbursed from the proceeds of sale. So we often do this when we purchase condo docs, different things, and we submit our receipt to the buyer's lawyer. The buyer's lawyer pays us out of the proceeds of sale before paying the balance out, or it will come from the seller's lawyer. We get paid back. So we're happy.
And how do you structure that in the contract?
Well, it doesn't actually have to enter into the contract. The realtor could actually go out, pay for everything, and submit the expenses to the buyer's lawyer, and the buyer's lawyer will pay us. If we're on the seller's side and we're doing it, same thing. The seller's lawyer, prior to paying out the owner of the property, the dollars that are left, the equity basically after all closing costs, this would be considered a closing cost.
So paint a picture kind of as basic as you can do it. So seller says to realtor, I want to be able to do something kind of fun and kind of sexy to make more people want to sell this house that isn't just a price reduction. And then they come up with the idea of, we are going to give you a year's free tickets to the Stampeders, or whatever it is. So we say that. And then, so realtor has to say to seller, let me tell you what the implications could be for the mortgage.
Yes.
How would you explain that in a really basic way?
Okay, I would explain to them, if the buyer was coming, they had 5% they had to put down, they have a 95% mortgage, and we need a $300,000 mortgage. The bank would view the value of that as not adding any value to the home, and the reason the buyer was choosing that property was simply to get this gift item. So they're saying we're not going to finance that because the seller is receiving money, the reason it's done. So they would deduct the value of that from the amount of mortgage funds they'd be willing to give. So if it was $2,000, the buyer will only get $298, which means someone will have to come up with additional down payment to offset that shortfall that the bank is providing. So there is an implication there, and we have to be aware that when we're a buyer's realtor, if we see those incentives out there of advising our client, making sure that when we go through the financing process, that how it's going to impact and make sure our client can still afford and buy the home.
Right.
Someone with a huge down payment that goes, well, it'd be really nice to get the additional trip, they may not care.
Not matter.
They'll go, great, I'll take
Right.
the cruise, I'll take whatever's offered. And I can add the additional cash to my down payment to make up that
But for some of the first-time home buyers on lower incomes under new
May
mortgage
not
rules,
work.
like that $2,500 might actually be a bit of it. But I mean, I guess for them, they could just say to the seller, we don't want that, we're just,
Exactly.
you just
As a
figure it
buyer's
out.
realtor, you can go in and say, well, instead of giving my client that trip, let's take that $2,000 off the purchase price. And it really does end up achieving what the seller wants. It's going to
Foot in the
drive
door.
showings,
yeah.
which may lead to an offer. And at the end of the day, they really don't care if they're going to put $2,000 out, whether it's for paint, a lower purchase price, a trip, tickets. It achieves the end result of getting the property sold, keeps both realtors within the rules.
So we mentioned the word kind of an inducement in the beginning. So as far as the difference between an incentive and an inducement specifically for listings,
Yep.
speak to that.
Okay, so in Rika's eyes, there's two things that we can do and not do. One, we can offer incentives and inducements, but incentives have to be offered by the whole brokerage. They can be advertised ahead of time. So you could tie it like we did with our Happy Home contest. That's a brokerage-wide contest. We can market it. They enter to win. perfectly fine to do. A realtor tries to do the same thing on their own, enter to win an air conditioner, and they advertise it, not allowed.
No.
So an incentive is something that tends to happen and should happen during the actual process of the transaction and can't be advertised or marketed ahead of time. Still needs to be approved by the brokerage, and that can be done one of two ways. On a case
This is
by
an inducement?
this is an inducement.
An inducement, sorry.
An inducement is specific to one transaction only.
Right.
So we're doing our negotiation and the realtor says, if you buy this house, I will pay for the home inspection. If you buy this house, I will pay for your lawyer's fees. They can't market.
Can you say, if you buy this house, I'll give you a year of Stampeders tickets?
You can,
But it
but
would still affect the transaction in the same way?
it would affect the transaction in some ways, and it requires brokerage approval, and it must be paid for through the brokerage. So,
okay.
and that's where a lot
The
of us
realtor
don't
can't
realize.
just be like, here.
And that's why I use the example of lawyer's fees, because lots of
Right.
people, and you can't even put that in your marketing plan. So if every time you go out to do a listing or work with a buyer, you say, I will pay your lawyer's fees, that is not an inducement, that's now an incentive and should be brokerage-wide.
Right.
But if we're in the heat of the moment and I say to get this deal closed, if I'm not going to give $1,000 off in commission, but I will pay up to $500 towards legal fees, or I will pay up to $500 for a home inspection. And they agree to that, we put it into the contract, or we do a side with it, but it must be approved by the brokerage in writing, and or be a preset policy. So if CIR said at any time, any realtor, if they want to, we will allow you to offer to pay for lawyer services or paying for home inspections, things like that. It could be a blanket policy. We prefer to leave it as a case-by-case basis and let our realtors do what they want to do, come to us for approval. And we'll give that approval in writing, and then the brokerage will actually pay it. So if you were going to say, hire Jeff Gahane and we're gonna cover the legal fees up to $1,000, the brokerage would physically cut that check to Jeff Gahane's law firm on behalf of your client, and then it would be put on your CIR account or be taken off of your commissions, however you want to structure it internally.
That makes
But
sense.
you can't physically write the check out yourself, tear it off, and give it to Jeff. That is in violation of the rules.
But
There's-
and some people do that?
And that's more not because they're trying to hide it.
They just don't know.
It's just out of ignorance. They go,
Right.
well, I know I'm allowed to do things like that. But there are two really good RECA bulletins. So if you go on RECA.ca and you go to the information bulletins, you can click for an alphabetical list, go right to inducements and incentives, and there's two really fantastic bulletins there that explain it step by step, what you can
Perfect.
do and you can't do. And if you can't remember that, just call one of the managers at any time, get the quick connect. We'll find that bulletin for you, get it to you, go through it, make sure you understand the process. But don't be out there offering inducements every time, because if you offer it every time, it's no
an
longer an
incentive.
inducement, it becomes an incentive, and you'll end up in RECA jail, as we call it.
Right.
And that gets expensive quickly
Yeah, fair.
and can affect your license.
So this isn't kind of part of our questions, but just to end it, and you can only say one for each. Only say one for each. But from your experience selling, or when you were taking clients out or listing agents, so question number one would be, if you were working with a seller and the seller said, I want to offer an incentive that you think is going to suddenly drum up more traffic in this listing, and you had to suggest one incentive to the seller, one seller incentive, what would you say? I think the seller incentive you offer should be, what would your suggestion
Well, for
be?
me, it would be offer Stampeders tickets, because who wouldn't want them? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Offering these things out, people understand that it is, we want you to just come and look at
So
the
you
house.
like the idea of something kind of shiny and fun versus a
Something
holdback for $2,000 to
Yes.
improve something.
Well, if it will drive more showings and the seller is willing to spend the money, I'll discuss it with them. I've always been in favor more of the best, absolute best incentive in the world is an aggressively priced property. In a challenging market where everybody's pricing aggressively, we may have to do something to offset. Sometimes these things disappear during negotiations.
Right.
So if it drew the offer out and now they're hammering hard at our seller for pricing, we can certainly introduce that, that cruise, those tickets, that whatever shiny thing we offered will come off the table because you apparently would prefer a lower price. And we're okay
Right.
with that because we're just moving the incentive really to changing it to, we would have spent X, so we'll take it off the purchase price. And then that can work. I'm not really a big fan of seller incentives simply because I believe we need to have the property prepared absolutely perfectly every time is a much better way. But if we're trying to generate extra showings, it can help. But it's not why someone, I believe, is going to buy a property if they have a brain, or the buyer's realtor is going to say to them, do you really want the trip, or would you rather get the cost of the trip off?
That was my last question to you is, from your experience working with buyers, if somebody had seller incentives, would you say that would the buyer be like, ooh, exciting? Like, from their perspective, was that a foot in the door? Did you find that made a difference?
We don't see them that offered. More typical would be things like flooring allowances, painting allowances, addressing an issue within the property.
And did people like that?
Yes, especially in the more entry-level, first-time, second-time buyers that don't have a lot of spare money, and they're trying to get that house in the neighborhood they want. So sometimes they're leaning towards the one that's a little rougher, a little more care required. So if they had the opportunity to say,
a little spending money.
This is money that can be used and I can get the new flooring, or I can get rid of the 4 different colored bedrooms this way, it's a good marketing technique to address sometimes deficiencies in the property. And then as a seller's agent, when the showings are booked, and I know everything comes over showing time and we don't. If you're using one of these, that's when you should be picking up the phone, talking to the buyer's realtor, really explaining the issue, getting them ready to manage their client's expectation before they see the home, and say, like, we understand there's an issue and there's a solution. Make sure you present it to your client, because we're priced aggressively and we're going to fix an issue that may be in 3 or 4 other houses you're looking at as well.
That's awesome advice.
So it's really about managing expectations both from the seller side and the buying side. That's
really great, David. That's I think that's all that we had here. Is there anything else that we maybe didn't cover that you want to add, or do we think we've done a pretty good job?
Photos, photos, photos. As the seasons change, update, update, update. It is the best money you will spend on marketing any home is quality, quality photos.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
Totally agree with you. All right, well, thank you, David, for your time. Thanks to all of you for tuning in today. We really appreciate it. Next Monday, we are going to have one of our Agent Pursuit videos, and it's a really good one. So I'm not too sure how many of you know Sue Stiles. Sue Stiles is a local real estate coach here in Calgary, and she has coached and worked with and for some of the absolute top teams and top realtors in this city. And she's going to come on and talking about business setup, some of the best strategies that have worked for these realtors teams in getting business, how growth is scaled, how to set up your business for a foundation so you can get from 10 to 20 to 50 to 80 deals, all from personal experience that she's had working with some of these really big producers who may have started really little. So please tune in for that. Again, it's going to be some great advice from firsthand knowledge of what it takes to be extremely successful and to be able to manage and scale up for that type of success. So tune in on Monday and you'll be able to watch us for that. Otherwise, have a really great week. And as Ellen would say, be kind to one another.
Absolutely. Stay positive, be kind. When you need to vent, don't vent at a client or another realtor.
Yeah.
Pick a loved one who will allow you to.
Michaela, I thought you were going to say call us. No, it's going to be like,
no, God, no.
No.
I'm not a family member. Well, I may be for one realtor.
This is true.
But the thing is we have to be there for our people. So anything we can do to help you, we're always here.
Totally. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.